The evening rush at the Ivory Keys restaurant was in full swing. The clinking of glasses mixed with the hum of conversation as Sophie wiped down a recently vacated table. She tucked a strand of brown hair behind her ear and glanced at her watch. 4 more hours to go. Her feet already ached, but she couldn't afford to complain. Not when her younger brother Theo needed his medication. The Ivory Keys wasn't just another fancy restaurant in the city. It got its name from the beautiful grand piano that sat in the corner of the main dining area. It was a Steinway, worth more than Sophie would make in 5 years of waiting tables. Most nights the piano remained untouched, a decoration more than an instrument. Sometimes on weekends the owner hired a musician to play soft background music, but tonight, a Tuesday, the piano sat silent. Sophie had been working at the Ivory Keys for almost 3 years now. She'd started right after her parents' accident, when life had shifted from college plans to hospital bills and guardianship papers. At 24, while her former classmates were finishing graduate school or starting careers, Sophie was juggling 2 jobs and making sure her 16-year-old brother got to his doctor's appointments. Sophie, table 12 needs water, and the Harrington party just arrived in the private room. Diane, the shift manager, called out as she rushed past with a tray of appetizers. Sophie nodded and grabbed a pitcher of ice water. The Harrington party. She'd heard the whispers all day. James Harrington, the tech millionaire who had made his fortune developing some app Sophie couldn't afford to download, had reserved the entire back section for his birthday celebration. The staff had been briefed. Be invisible but attentive. Anticipate needs before they're expressed, and above all, don't mess up. The private dining area of the Ivory Keys was separated from the main restaurant by a curved archway. As Sophie entered, she could feel the different energy immediately. 15 people sat around a long table, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Their laughter seemed louder, more confident than the careful conversations in the main dining room. At the head of the table sat a man Sophie recognized from magazine covers and news segments. James Harrington didn't look like a typical millionaire. No gray hair or tailored suit. Instead, he wore dark jeans and a casual button-up shirt, with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. His dark hair was slightly messy, and a short beard framed his face. He looked younger in person, maybe mid-30s, and something about his eyes seemed restless, as if he was already bored with his own party. "Water for everyone?" Sophie asked quietly, approaching the table. A few guests nodded without looking at her. She began filling glasses, working her way around the table. "And then I told him either double the investment or walk away," a woman in a red dress was saying. He doubled it, of course. No one says no to me these days. The table erupted in laughter that seemed practiced, performed. Sophie continued her task, trying to be quick but careful. When she reached James Harrington, he was looking at his phone, scrolling with one hand while the other tapped an impatient rhythm on the table. "Water, sir?" Sophie asked. He glanced up briefly. "Sure, whatever." As Sophie tilted the pitcher, James suddenly moved his arm to point something out on his phone to the person beside him. The movement caught Sophie off guard, and water splashed onto the table and his sleeve. "I'm so sorry," Sophie gasped, quickly grabbing napkins from her apron pocket. "Let me clean that up right away." The conversation at the table halted. Several guests looked at her with disapproval, as if she'd just committed an unforgivable sin. Sophie's heart raced as she dabbed at the spill, painfully aware of 15 pairs of eyes on her. Her hands trembled slightly, and she silently calculated how much of her tip money would go toward dry cleaning if he demanded it. But James Harrington didn't yell or make a scene. Instead, he looked at Sophie, really looked at her for the first time. His eyes weren't angry but curious, almost amused. "No harm done," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle compared to the commanding tone he'd been using with his guests. "It's just water. Thank you, sir. I'm very sorry about that." Sophie continued wiping up the spilled water. As she reached across to dry the table, her sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing a small tattoo on the inside of her wrist, a simple design of piano keys. Just 5 black and white keys inked in delicate lines. James noticed it. "You play?" he asked, nodding toward her wrist. Sophie quickly pulled her sleeve down. "I used to," she said, trying to keep her voice professional. "Not anymore." Something shifted in James's expression, interest perhaps. "That's a shame," he said. "Why'd you stop?" The question caught Sophie off guard. Customers rarely asked servers personal questions, especially not wealthy ones at private parties. They usually looked through her, not at her. Life happened, she answered simply, not wanting to share her story with a table full of strangers. More water for anyone else? James continued to watch her as she moved around the table, topping off glasses. There was something calculating in his gaze now, as if he was solving a puzzle only he could see. Sophie finished with the water and excused herself to check on her other tables. As she walked away, she could feel James Harrington's eyes following her. It made her uncomfortable, but she pushed the feeling aside. Rich people were often odd, and as long as they tipped well, she could handle a bit of strangeness. The next hour passed in a blur of food orders, drink refills, and the usual restaurant chaos. Sophie moved between her regular tables and the Harrington party, who seemed to grow louder and more demanding as the wine flowed. They ordered the most expensive items on the menu without glancing at prices, sent back perfectly good dishes for minor imperfections, and treated special requests as basic expectations. Through it all, James Harrington remained somewhat detached from his own celebration. He laughed at jokes and raised his glass for toasts, but Sophie noticed how his attention drifted. Several times she caught him looking around the restaurant with that same restless expression, as if searching for something more interesting than the people he'd invited. During the main course, Sophie overheard snippets of conversation as she served plates. "James, you have to tell them about the new project," urged a man in an expensive watch. James shrugged. "It's nothing special. Just another app that tells people what they already know about themselves." "Don't be modest," said the woman in red. "Your last nothing special sold for what, 300 million? More laughter, more toasts. Sophie carefully set down a plate of seared scallops in front of James. He nodded his thanks but didn't really see her. His mind seemed elsewhere. As the dinner service continued, Sophie noticed James becoming increasingly distracted. He checked his watch often and replied to questions with short, uninterested answers. During dessert, while everyone else was engaged in a heated debate about property investments, James's gaze wandered to the main dining room, specifically to the grand piano sitting unused in the corner. When Sophie came to clear his barely touched chocolate soufflé, he finally spoke to her again. "That piano," he said, nodding toward it. "Does anyone ever play it?" "Sometimes on weekends," Sophie replied. "The owner hires a pianist for Friday and Saturday nights. But not tonight." "No, sir. Not on Tuesdays," James nodded thoughtfully. "Seems like a waste. A piano should be played, not just looked at." Before Sophie could respond, he turned back to his guests, but something had changed. The restless energy had focused into something more deliberate. He began engaging more actively in conversations, laughing louder, gesturing more broadly. But Sophie could tell it wasn't genuine interest. It was the behavior of someone with a plan. As she continued her work, Sophie caught James looking at her wrist again whenever she served his table. Each time she tried to keep her tattoo covered, but somehow he always managed to glimpse it. It made her think about the piano in her childhood home, the hours of practice, the dreams she'd packed away along with her sheet music, when reality demanded different priorities. By the time the Harrington party was on their third round of after-dinner drinks, the main dining room had mostly cleared out. Only a few couples remained, lingering over coffee and dessert. The atmosphere had shifted to that quiet lull before closing, time when restaurants seemed to exhale after the rush. Sophie was tallying receipts at the server station when she heard James Harrington's voice rise above the murmur of conversation. "I've been thinking," he announced to his table, but loudly enough that everyone in the restaurant could hear. "This party needs something more, something unexpected." His guests turned to him with interest, used to his spontaneous ideas that often led to extravagant gestures or adventures. "We have this beautiful piano," James continued, standing up and gesturing toward the Steinway. "And I bet someone in this room knows how to play it." Sophie froze, receipt book in hand. She kept her eyes down, suddenly very interested in calculating tips. "In fact," James said, his voice carrying clear across the restaurant, "I'm willing to make things interesting. $10,000 to any staff member who can play something impressive on that piano right now." A shocked murmur ran through the restaurant. The remaining diners turned to watch. The other servers exchanged glances, nervous laughter bubbling up as they shook their heads. "Anyone?" James pressed, looking around with a challenging smile. "No hidden talents among you?" Sophie kept her head down, but she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. $10,000. Theo's treatment for a year, maybe even enough left over for a semester of classes. All for playing the piano. The one thing she'd been good at. The one dream she'd had to abandon. She didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until she felt Diane nudge her. "Sophie?" The manager whispered. "Didn't you say once you used to play?" Before Sophie could answer, she felt eyes on her. She looked up to find James Harrington staring directly at her from across the room, a knowing smile on his face. "You," he said, pointing right at her, the one with the piano keys on her wrist. "I dare you to play." The room fell silent as James Harrington's words hung in the air. "You? The one with the piano keys on her wrist? I dare you to play." Sophie felt her face grow hot as every head in the restaurant turned toward her. The other servers stepped back slightly, creating a small circle of empty space around her. As if her spotlight moment might be contagious, she clutched her receipt book tighter, the pen between her fingers suddenly slippery with sweat. I'm working, sir," she managed to say, her voice smaller than she intended. James Harrington's smile widened. There was something boyish about his expression now, the boredom completely gone from his eyes. He looked alive with curiosity. "I'm pretty sure your boss won't mind," he said, glancing at Diane. "Will you?" Diane hesitated, caught between restaurant protocol and the desire to please a wealthy customer. Her eyes darted to Sophie, then back to James. "Well, I suppose if Sophie wants to." $10,000, James repeated, emphasizing each word. "For playing a piano, that's more than most people here make in 3 months." The remaining diners were watching with undisguised interest now. Some had even taken out their phones, sensing a moment worth recording. Sophie felt trapped in a spotlight she'd never asked for. "Go on, Sophie," one of the other waiters whispered. "What have you got to lose?" Everything, she thought. Her dignity, her carefully constructed wall between past and present, the memory of her last recital, the rejection letter that came a week later. "I haven't played in years," she said, addressing James directly now. "You'd be wasting your money." "Let me decide what's a waste of my money," James replied with a dismissive wave. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook, then a pen from his shirt pocket. With deliberate movements, he began writing. $10,000 made out to Sophie, supplied Diane helpfully. Sophie Chen. Sophie Chen, James repeated as he wrote her name. He looked up at her again. "Well, Sophie Chen with the piano key tattoo? What's it going to be? A quick song for enough cash to change your life, or back to clearing tables?" One of James's friends, a tall man with a perfectly trimmed beard, chuckled. "James always gets what he wants one way or another. It's how he became James Harrington." "Not always," James corrected, his eyes never leaving Sophie. "That's what makes life interesting, those rare times when things don't go as expected." There was a challenge in his voice now, as if daring her to be one of those unexpected things. Sophie looked over at the piano. From where she stood, she could see a thin layer of dust on its glossy black surface. When was the last time she'd touched a piano? 5 years ago? The thought of sitting on that bench, of placing her fingers on those keys after so long, made her stomach twist into knots. "I think our guest has made a very generous offer," said a new voice. It was Robert, the restaurant owner, who must have been called from his office by the commotion. He looked at Sophie with what she recognized as his business smile, the one that said, "Do what the customer wants." "Sophie, why don't you take a short break from your duties? I'm sure your tables can wait a few minutes. It wasn't really a suggestion." Sophie knew that tone. It was the same one he used when telling servers to accept bad tips with a smile or to comp meals for complaining customers. Trapped from all sides, Sophie slowly set down her receipt book on the nearest table. The room seemed to hold its breath as she walked toward the piano, each step feeling heavier than the last. The short distance across the restaurant floor stretched into miles. As she passed James's table, he held out the check to her. "For motivation," he said with a wink. Sophie didn't take it. "After," she said quietly. "If I earn it." Something flickered in James's expression, surprise perhaps, or respect. He nodded and tucked the check into his shirt pocket, then followed her to the piano. His party trailed behind like a flock of expensive birds, drinks in hand, expectant smiles on their faces. The remaining regular diners joined them, forming a loose semicircle around the piano. Sophie stood beside the bench for a moment, looking at the instrument. It was beautiful, a concert grand with the lid partially open. She reached out and brushed her fingertips over the fallboard that covered the keys, feeling the cool, smooth wood beneath her skin. "What are you going to play for us, Sophie Chen?" James asked, standing closer than necessary, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Sophie didn't answer. Instead, she sat down and slowly opened the fallboard, revealing 88 keys of black and white. The sight of them sent a jolt through her body, muscle memory waking up after a long sleep. She placed her hands in her lap, willing them to stop trembling. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered something that made others laugh softly. Sophie blocked it all out, focusing only on the keyboard in front of her. What could she possibly play after all this time? Her mind raced through pieces she once knew by heart. Bach, too technical. Mozart? Too delicate for fingers that hadn't practiced in years. "We're waiting," sang out the woman in the red dress from James's party, her voice laced with whine and impatience. Sophie took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. The cool ivory felt both foreign and familiar against her fingertips. Without conscious thought, she began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor filled the room. She'd chosen it without really choosing. It was simply there, waiting in her muscles and bones, the piece she'd practiced more than any other. The piece she'd played for her Juilliard audition. The piece she'd played the day the rejection letter came. The opening was gentle, questioning. Sophie's fingers moved stiffly at first, finding their way back to a language they'd once been fluent in. A wrong note here, a hesitation there. But then, like riding a bicycle after years away, something clicked into place. Her hands remembered what her mind had tried to forget. As the piece progressed, building in intensity, Sophie closed her eyes. She didn't need to see the keys anymore. They were extensions of her fingers now. The restaurant around her faded away. There was only the music, speaking through her after years of silence. She was barely aware of the hush that had fallen over the crowd. The whispers stopped. The clinks of glasses ceased. Even the kitchen staff had paused their work, peering through the service window to watch. James Harrington stood closest to the piano, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. The amused smile was gone, replaced by something more complex. He watched Sophie's face as she played, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the slight part of her lips as she breathed with the music. As the ballade approached its middle section, Sophie's confidence grew. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm, her feet finding the pedals naturally. The mistakes became fewer, the hesitations disappeared. Years of training reasserted themselves through her fingertips. This wasn't just muscle memory anymore, it was Sophie herself. The part she'd packed away with her dreams. Emerging note by note, the piece grew more dramatic, cascading runs flowing from her hands as if they'd never stopped playing. Sophie felt tears forming behind her closed eyelids, but didn't let them fall. This wasn't about sadness or regret. It was about remembering who she had been, who she might still be. As she navigated the complex middle passages, someone in the audience gasped softly. Perhaps they hadn't expected this level of skill from a waitress. Perhaps they were simply moved by the music itself. Sophie didn't care. For the first time in years, she wasn't playing for anyone but herself. The final sections of the ballad were the most technically demanding. Rapid scales, complex harmonies, emotional intensity building toward a powerful conclusion. Sophie's fingers flew across the keys, finding strength and precision she'd forgotten she possessed. Her whole body was involved now, leaning into the fortissimo passages, pulling back for the more delicate moments. When she struck the final chords, letting them ring out and fade naturally into silence, Sophie kept her eyes closed for a moment longer. She didn't want to see the faces watching her, didn't want to break the spell that had transported her back to a different life. The silence that followed was complete. No applause, no whispers, not even the sound of breathing. Just a perfect, suspended moment of collective astonishment. Sophie opened her eyes and looked down at her hands, still resting on the keys. They were trembling again, but not from nervousness, from the release of something long held back. When she finally turned to face her audience, she was startled by what she saw. The woman in the red dress had tears streaming down her face, leaving tracks in her makeup. Robert, the restaurant owner, stood with his mouth slightly open. Diane was beaming with shocked pride as if she'd just discovered a diamond among the silverware. And James Harrington. James was completely still, His eyes locked on Sophie with an intensity that made her look away. The calculated amusement was gone. The restless boredom was nowhere to be seen. Instead, there was something like wonder on his face. For 10 long seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The entire restaurant seemed frozen in a moment outside of time. Then James stepped forward, breaking the spell. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the check he'd written earlier. Looking at it for a moment, he shook his head slightly. Then he tore it in half. Sophie's heart sank. Had she not played well enough? Had he found her performance lacking? But James was already pulling out his checkbook again, writing a new check with quick, decisive strokes. When he finished, he held it out to Sophie. That, he said, his voice slightly hoarse, was worth more than $10,000. Sophie stared at the check in his outstretched hand. The amount written on it made her breath catch. $50,000. I can't accept this, she whispered too quietly for anyone but James to hear. You can, he replied, just as softly, and you will. Because we both know that's not even close to what your talent is worth. Before she could respond, the spell of silence broke completely. The restaurant erupted in applause, people rising to their feet, some wiping away tears, others shaking their heads in disbelief. As the applause washed over her, Sophie realized that something fundamental had changed in the past 5 minutes. The wall she'd built between her past and present had crumbled. The person she'd been and the person she'd become were no longer separate. And as James Harrington pressed the check into her hand with a firm nod, Sophie understood that this wasn't just about money. It was about possibility, about doors that might still be open, about dreams that might not be as dead as she'd thought. The applause eventually faded, but the energy in the room had completely transformed. Sophie sat frozen on the piano bench, the check for $50,000 clutched in her hand, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Customers who had never noticed her before were smiling at her with newfound respect. Her fellow servers looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Robert, the restaurant owner, approached with an expression Sophie had never seen on his face before, a mixture of surprise and something that looked almost like guilt. Sophie, he said, his voice unusually gentle, I had no idea. How long have you been playing? Sophie tucked the check into her apron pocket, still not quite believing it was real. Since I was 5, she answered quietly. But I stopped about 5 years ago. 5 years? James Harrington had been listening nearby. He shook his head in disbelief. That performance didn't sound like someone who hasn't played in 5 years. Sophie looked down at her hands. They were still trembling slightly, but it felt different now, like energy rather than nervousness. I used to practice 8 hours a day, she explained. Every day. For 14 years. A murmur rippled through the crowd. That kind of dedication was something they could understand, even those who knew nothing about music. Why did you stop? James asked the question directly, without his earlier playfulness. His eyes were serious now, studying her face with genuine curiosity. Sophie hesitated. She didn't talk about this, not with anyone. Theo knew, of course, but even with him, she kept the details vague. It was easier that way. But something about the moment, perhaps the lingering effect of the music, perhaps the intensity of James's gaze, made her want to answer honestly. I was rejected from Juilliard, she said, the words still painful after all this time. I thought I was good enough, but I wasn't. Then my parents... She paused, swallowing hard. There was an accident. Suddenly I had a 16-year-old brother to take care of. Medical bills, no time for dreams anymore. Sophie hadn't meant to say so much. The words had tumbled out before she could stop them. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made her want to run back to the kitchen and hide among the dirty dishes and food orders. But James didn't look at her with pity, the way she had feared. Instead, he seemed to be calculating something, that same expression he'd worn earlier when he first noticed her tattoo. Juilliard made a mistake, he said finally, with the confidence of someone used to making definitive judgments. He turned to the woman in the red dress who was dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Don't you agree, Vivian? The woman, Vivian, nodded firmly. Absolutely. That was extraordinary. Sophie felt her cheeks grow warm. It was just muscle memory, she said, trying to downplay their praise. And I made mistakes. A lot of them. Not enough to matter, James countered. He looked around the restaurant at the people still watching them, then back to Sophie. Let me ask you something, Sophie Chen. If circumstances had been different, if you hadn't needed to support your brother, if life hadn't gotten in the way, what would you be doing right now? The question struck Sophie like a physical blow. What would she be doing? It was something she'd forced herself not to think about for years. I'd be playing, she said simply. Somewhere, anywhere. It's the only thing I ever wanted to do. James nodded as if she'd confirmed something he'd already guessed. And your brother now? You mentioned medical bills? Sophie was surprised by the personal question, but found herself answering anyway. He's better. Not completely, but better. He had a rare form of juvenile arthritis. The treatments are expensive, and our insurance only covers part of it. She touched the check in her pocket. This will help. A lot. Good, James said with a sharp nod. That's good. The crowd around them had begun to thin, people returning to their tables or preparing to leave. The moment of magic was passing, reality reasserting itself. Sophie suddenly remembered that she was still on the clock, that she had tables waiting, bills to be calculated. I should get back to work, she said, standing up from the piano bench. Thank you. For this. She touched her apron pocket again, still not quite believing what was inside it. Wait, James said as she turned to go. There's someone I think you should meet. He gestured to a woman who had been standing quietly at the edge of his party. This is my sister, Lisa Harrington Wong. The woman stepped forward. She was older than James, perhaps in her 40s, with the same dark eyes but a more serious demeanor. She wore a simple black dress that somehow looked more elegant than the flashier outfits of the other party guests. Lisa is the director of the Bay Area Conservatory of Music, James explained. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The Bay Area Conservatory was well known, not as prestigious as Juilliard perhaps, but still highly respected. Students from around the world competed for spots in its programs. Lisa extended her hand. That was quite something, Ms. Chen. My brother has always had a knack for theatrics, but in this case I think his instincts were right on target. You're very talented. Sophie shook her hand, trying to keep her own from trembling again. Thank you, but really I'm out of practice. What you heard wasn't... What I heard, Lisa interrupted gently, was a musician. Not a perfect performance, no. But music isn't about perfection. It's about communication, about feeling, and you communicated beautifully. Sophie didn't know what to say. After years of defining herself by what she wasn't, not good enough, not talented enough, not dedicated enough, it was disorienting to hear someone like Lisa Harrington Wong suggest otherwise. We should talk, Lisa continued, reaching into a sleek handbag and pulling out a business card. I'd like to hear more of your playing. Perhaps you could come to the conservatory next week? Say Wednesday morning? Sophie stared at the card. For what exactly? Let's call it an informal audition, Lisa said with a small smile. No pressure. Just a conversation between musicians. An audition. The word alone was enough to send a cold wave of panic through Sophie's body. Her last audition had ended with a rejection that changed the course of her life. The thought of putting herself through that again, of risking that same crushing disappointment. I don't know, she began, looking for a way to politely decline. Say yes, Sophie, James cut in. His tone was softer than before, almost gentle. What's the worst that could happen? The worst that could happen? Sophie almost laughed. The worst was that she'd remember what it felt like to hope again, only to have that hope extinguished a second time. The worst was that she'd have to rebuild the walls between past and present, that tonight had momentarily torn down. But as she looked at the business card in her hand, another thought surfaced. Maybe the worst had already happened. Maybe living with regret, with the question of what might have been, was worse than any rejection could be. Okay, she heard herself say. Wednesday. Lisa smiled, a genuine warmth reaching her eyes. Excellent. 10 o'clock? Sophie nodded, tucking the card beside the check in her apron pocket. Now, I really do need to get back to work before I get fired, she said, trying to lighten the moment. I don't think there's much chance of that happening tonight, James replied with a small laugh. Something tells me Robert might be reconsidering your role here. As if on cue, Robert appeared at Sophie's elbow. Take the rest of the night off, Sophie, he said, his business smile now tinged with genuine admiration. Diane can cover your tables. We should talk tomorrow about opportunities. Opportunities. The word hung in the air, full of possibility. Thank you, Sophie said, but I'd rather finish my shift. The normality of work would help ground her, give her time to process everything that had happened. Besides, she needed the tips, magical check or no magical check. Robert looked surprised but nodded. As you wish. But the offer stands. As Sophie walked back toward the server station, she felt different somehow. The same restaurant, the same job, but something fundamental had shifted inside her. She had stepped back into a version of herself she thought was gone forever, and that version refused to disappear again. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Sophie moved between tables, took orders, delivered food, calculated bills, all the familiar routines of her job. But customers looked at her differently now. Some asked if she was the pianist they'd heard about from other diners. One elderly couple requested that she play again, an offer Sophie gently declined. James Harrington's party stayed until closing, growing quieter as the night progressed. Sophie noticed that James himself seemed more relaxed now, more present with his guests. The restlessness she'd observed earlier had vanished. Occasionally their eyes would meet across the room, and he would give her a small nod, as if acknowledging a shared secret. When the last customers finally left and the cleaning began, Sophie found herself drawn back to the piano. The restaurant was empty now except for staff. She sat on the bench again, not to play, just to feel the keys beneath her fingertips. "You're full of surprises, Chen," said Paul, one of the other servers, as he wiped down nearby tables. 5 years working together and I had no idea you were some kind of piano genius." Sophie smiled faintly. "Not a genius. Just someone who used to love something very much." "Used to?" Paul raised an eyebrow. "That didn't look like used to me." Sophie didn't answer. Instead, she pressed a single key, letting the clear note ring out in the quiet restaurant. Then another, not playing a piece, just reacquainting herself with the instrument, like greeting an old friend after a long separation. As she gathered her things to leave, Sophie realized she hadn't looked at her phone all evening. Pulling it from her pocket, she saw 3 missed calls and a text message from Theo. "Where are you? Everything okay?" Sophie smiled to herself. What would she even tell him? How could she possibly explain everything that had happened tonight? Walking to the bus stop, Sophie felt the weight of the check and business card in her pocket. $50,000 and a second chance. A week ago, even a day ago, neither had seemed possible. The night air was cool against her skin. Sophie looked up at the sky, at the few stars visible through the city lights. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder what might be possible. What doors might open if she found the courage to walk through them. As the bus approached, Sophie made a decision. When she got home, she would dig out the box she'd stored in the back of her closet, the one containing her sheet music, her practice notebooks, all the pieces of her musical past she'd been unable to throw away but couldn't bear to look at. It was time to remember, time to practice, time to see if the path she'd abandoned might still be waiting for her after all. The next 5 days passed in a whirlwind for Sophie. By the time she'd arrived home that night, the video was already spreading. Someone from James Harrington's party had recorded her performance and shared it online with the caption, "Waitress stunned millionaire with her hidden talent." The comments section overflowed with amazement, people demanding to know who she was, where they could hear more. Sophie had shown Theo the check first thing when she got home, watching his eyes widen in disbelief. $50,000? He'd whispered, touching the paper as if to make sure it was real. "For playing the piano? Are you serious?" "Apparently I'm better than I thought," Sophie had joked, but there was a catch in her voice. The events of the evening still felt like a dream, something that had happened to someone else. "You've always been amazing," Theo said firmly. "I told you that. Mom and Dad told you that. Juilliard was wrong." Sophie had just hugged him, not trusting herself to speak. Then she'd gone to her closet and pulled out the box she'd stored away 5 years ago. Sheet music, practice journals, competition certificates, all the artifacts of her former life. The next morning, she'd deposited the check, half expecting it to bounce. But the bank teller had smiled and informed her the funds would be available within 2 business days. It was real, all of it. Now sitting on a hard bench outside a practice room at the Bay Area Conservatory of Music, Sophie felt her stomach twist with anxiety. She'd spent every spare moment of the past 5 days practicing, her fingers aching in a way they hadn't in years. The muscle memory was there, but her technique had grown rusty. 5 years was a long time to be away from something that required such precision. The hallway was quiet except for faint music drifting from distant rooms. Occasionally, someone would walk past, a student with a violin case, a professor carrying stacks of sheet music. Each time, Sophie straightened her posture, trying to look like she belonged. She wore her nicest outfit, black pants and a dark blue blouse she usually saved for job interviews. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she'd even put on makeup, something she rarely bothered with for work at the restaurant. Lisa Harrington Wong had called yesterday to confirm their meeting. Her voice had been warm but professional. "Just bring yourself," she'd said when Sophie asked if she should prepare anything specific. "We'll have plenty of instruments available." The door to the practice room opened and a young man emerged, clutching a folder of music. He gave Sophie a curious glance as he passed. A moment later, Lisa appeared in the doorway. "Sophie," she said with a smile, "right on time. Please come in." The practice room was larger than Sophie had expected, with high ceilings and sound-absorbing panels on the walls. A grand piano dominated the space, its lid fully open. 2 chairs had been placed nearby, and a small table held a pitcher of water and glasses. "I hope you found us without trouble," Lisa said, closing the door. "Your directions were perfect," Sophie replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Her eyes kept drifting to the piano. It was a Steinway, similar to the one at the Ivory Keys, but newer, better maintained. The keys gleamed in the warm lighting. Lisa followed her gaze. "Beautiful, isn't it? One of our recent donations. Would you like to try it?" Sophie nodded, unable to find words. She approached the instrument slowly, almost reverently. Standing beside it, she ran her fingertips lightly over the fallboard, just as she had done at the restaurant. But this time there was no audience watching, no dare to fulfill, just a musician and an instrument. "Take your time," Lisa said, settling into one of the chairs. "Get acquainted." Sophie sat on the bench, adjusting its height. She opened the fallboard and placed her hands on the keys without pressing them, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips. Then, closing her eyes, she began to play. She started with a simple Bach prelude, something she'd practiced countless times over the years. The notes flowed more easily than she'd expected, her fingers finding their way home. The piano responded beautifully, the tone rich and clear. When she finished the piece, she opened her eyes to find Lisa watching her with an unreadable expression. "You play Bach very cleanly," Lisa commented. "What else have you been working on?" "I've been trying to get the Chopin back under my fingers," Sophie admitted. "The piece I played at the restaurant. And some Debussy. May I hear the Debussy?" Sophie nodded and began Clair de Lune, one of her favorite pieces. The dreamy, impressionistic music filled the room, and Sophie found herself relaxing into it. This wasn't an audition, she reminded herself, just a conversation between musicians. When she finished, Lisa was smiling. "Beautiful tone," she said. "You have a natural sensitivity that can't be taught." She paused, considering. "James told me a bit about your situation. You studied seriously for many years." "From age 5 to 19, Sophie confirmed. "My teacher was preparing me for conservatory. And then Juilliard rejected you. It wasn't a question, but Sophie answered anyway. "Yes, I only applied there. It was my dream school. When I didn't get in..." She trailed off, the memory still painful. "And that's when you stopped playing?" Sophie nodded. "Then my parents died a few months later. After that, there didn't seem to be any point in continuing. I had Theo to take care of." Lisa was quiet for a moment, studying Sophie with thoughtful eyes. "May I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you still love it? The piano? The music?" The question caught Sophie off guard. She'd been prepared to talk about her technique, her repertoire, her past accomplishments. "Not this, she began, then stopped. The honest answer surprised her. "Yes, I think I do. Playing the other night, it felt like finding a piece of myself I'd lost." She looked down at her hands. "But loving something doesn't mean you're good enough." Lisa leaned forward. "Sophie, let me be direct. You're very talented. Your technique needs work after 5 years away, but the foundation is clearly there. More importantly, you communicate when you play. That's rare." Hope flickered in Sophie's chest, but she tamped it down. "What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying that I'd like to offer you a place in our advanced certificate program. It's designed for postgraduate students and pre-professional musicians. You'd take private lessons, music theory, performance seminars, the works." Sophie stared at her, certain she'd misheard. You want me to study here? But I didn't even formally audition. Lisa smiled. What do you think you've been doing for the past 20 minutes? But I'm 24, Sophie protested. Most conservatory students are younger. Most conservatory students haven't lived the life you have, Lisa countered. Music isn't just about technical skill. It's about having something to say. You clearly do. She paused. There's also the matter of a scholarship. James has expressed interest in funding a full ride for you if you're interested. Sophie felt dizzy. This was too much, too fast. A week ago, she'd been a waitress with a buried past and limited future. Now she was being offered the chance to reclaim her dream, funded by a millionaire who'd heard her play once. I don't know what to say, she admitted. This is all happening so quickly. You don't have to decide right now, Lisa assured her. Take some time to think about it. But I should mention, the fall semester begins in 3 months. If you're interested, you'd have the summer to prepare, get back in shape technically. 3 months. Sophie tried to imagine it, leaving the restaurant, becoming a student again, surrounding herself with music and musicians. It was overwhelming. What about Theo? She asked. My brother. I support him. I can't just stop working. The scholarship would include a living stipend, Lisa said. And there are practice rooms available at all hours. You could arrange your schedule to still have time for your brother. It seemed too perfect, too easy. Life had taught Sophie that nothing came without a catch. Why would James do this? She asked. He doesn't even know me. Lisa's expression softened. My brother has many faults, but he's always had an eye for talent. And he believes in second chances. She hesitated. James was a talented cellist as a child. Did he mention that? Sophie shook her head, surprised. He was headed for a career in music until our father put a stop to it. Said it wasn't a real job for a Harrington man. Lisa's mouth twisted slightly. James gave up music to please our father, went into business instead. He's been very successful, obviously, but I think he's always wondered what might have been. She shrugged. Perhaps he sees in you a chance to change someone else's story. The revelation shifted something in Sophie's understanding of James Harrington. Not just a bored millionaire looking for entertainment, but someone who understood loss, who knew what it meant to set aside a passion. I need some time, Sophie said finally, to think about all of this. Of course, Lisa nodded. Why don't you play a bit more? You can try some of our other pianos if you'd like. I have a meeting, but you're welcome to stay for a while. After Lisa left, Sophie remained at the piano, letting her fingers wander over the keys. She played fragments of pieces she'd once known by heart, surprised by how many notes still lived in her muscle memory. The quiet of the practice room wrapped around her like a cocoon, the outside world temporarily held at bay. For the first time in 5 years, Sophie allowed herself to imagine a different future. Not the safe, predictable path of waiting tables and paying bills, but something riskier, something that made her heart beat faster. When she finally left the conservatory 2 hours later, stepping into the bright afternoon sunlight, Sophie felt as if she'd crossed an invisible boundary. Nothing had changed, yet everything was different. Her phone buzzed with a text from Theo. How did it go? Sophie smiled and typed back. It went well. Really well. We'll talk when I get home. At the bus stop, she checked her work schedule for the week. 5 shifts, including a double on Saturday. The routine that had defined her life for years. Yet now there was a door standing open beside that familiar path, offering a different way forward. As the bus approached, Sophie made another decision. Before going home, she would stop at a music store. She needed a keyboard for the apartment, something to practice on, and new sheet music, and perhaps a notebook for her own compositions, something she hadn't thought about in years. The bus ride passed in a blur of possibilities. Sophie gazed out the window, not really seeing the city passing by. Instead, she was picturing herself in a practice room like the one she'd just left, working for hours on a difficult passage. She was imagining a recital, her first in years. She was hearing music, not just the echoes of pieces she'd played before, but new melodies forming in her mind, waiting to be born. By the time she reached her stop, Sophie had made up her mind. She would accept Lisa's offer. She would take the second chance that had appeared so unexpectedly in her life. The path wouldn't be easy. 5 years away from serious study had left gaps in her technique, her endurance. She would need to work harder than the younger students, practice longer hours, But for the first time in years, Sophie felt fully awake, fully alive. The silence that had fallen over the restaurant when she played, that moment when everyone stopped and truly listened, had broken something open inside her. Something that couldn't be closed again. 3 months passed quickly, transforming Sophie's life in ways she could never have imagined. The day after her meeting with Lisa, she'd called the conservatory to accept the scholarship. 2 weeks later, she'd reduced her hours at the Ivory Keys to weekends only. The restaurant owner, Robert, had been surprisingly supportive, especially after the viral video had brought in customers hoping to see the piano waitress perform. Now, on a warm Friday evening in September, Sophie stood backstage at the conservatory's recital hall, waiting for her turn to perform. It was the opening concert of the semester, featuring selected students from each department. Lisa had asked Sophie to participate, suggesting it would be a good way to introduce herself to the conservatory community. 5 minutes. Ms. Chen, a stagehand, whispered. Clipboard in hand, Sophie nodded, her mouth too dry for words. She smoothed her black concert dress, a new purchase that had felt like an investment in her future. From the stage came the sound of applause as a violinist finished his piece and took a bow. Nervous? The voice behind her made Sophie turn. James Harrington stood there, looking different in a tailored suit than he had in the casual clothes he'd worn at the restaurant. Less boyish, more the successful businessman the world knew him to be. Terrified, Sophie admitted. Over the summer, she'd seen James occasionally at the conservatory when he visited his sister. Their interactions had been brief but friendly, the initial strangeness of their connection fading into something more comfortable. Good, James said with a small smile. That means you care. What if I mess up? What if everyone realizes I don't belong here? James considered her for a moment. Do you know why I dared you to play that night? Sophie shook her head. Because I saw how you looked at that piano. Not like it was furniture. Like it was alive, he paused. And because I recognized your tattoo. Piano keys. You don't get that if music is just a hobby. Sophie touched her wrist unconsciously, the small tattoo partially visible beneath the bracelet she wore. I took a chance, James continued. And so did you when you sat down and played. That's all anyone can do, really. Take chances, see what happens. The stagehand appeared again. You're up next, Ms. Chen. Sophie took a deep breath. Thank you, she said to James. Not just for tonight. For everything. James shook his head. Don't thank me. I didn't give you talent. I just noticed it. He stepped back. Now go show everyone else what I saw that night. As Sophie walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinded her. The recital hall was larger than she'd expected, with several hundred seats. Most were filled, a sea of faces looking back at her. Among them, in the front row, she spotted Theo, sitting between Lisa and James. Her brother gave her a thumbs up, his face glowing with pride. Sophie approached the piano, adjusting the bench before sitting down. The instrument was magnificent, far superior to anything she'd played before. She placed her hands on the keys, took one more deep breath, and began. She'd chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, arranged for solo piano, a piece she'd started learning over the summer. It was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for someone who'd taken a 5-year break, but it spoke to where she was now, the beginning of something new, complex and challenging, but ultimately hopeful. As she played the famous opening chords, Sophie felt the familiar shift in her consciousness, the world narrowing to just her hands and the keyboard. The nervousness didn't disappear completely, but it transformed into energy, into focus. The piece was a journey from the dark, heavy opening to the sweeping romanticism of the middle section, and finally to the triumphant conclusion. Sophie poured everything into it, the loss of her parents, the years of setting aside her dreams, the unexpected second chance. The music spoke what words couldn't express. When she struck the final chord, there was a moment of complete silence, just like at the restaurant 3 months ago. Then the applause began, building into something that seemed to fill the hall completely. Sophie stood and bowed, her heart pounding. As she looked out at the audience, she saw that Theo was on his feet, clapping wildly. Beside him, Lisa was smiling broadly, and James, usually so controlled, was whistling through his fingers. The reception after the concert was held in the conservatory's main lobby, with students, faculty, and guests mingling over refreshments. Sophie found herself surrounded by people offering congratulations, asking about her background, her training. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. "You were amazing," Theo said when he finally reached her side. At 16, he'd shot up in height over the summer and now stood taller than his sister. The medical treatments had worked wonders. His joints were no longer swollen, and he moved with the easy grace of a teenager rather than the careful steps of someone in pain. "I messed up the third movement," Sophie confessed. "The tempo got away from me." "Nobody noticed," Theo assured her. "They were too busy having their minds blown by everything else." "He's right," Lisa said, joining them with 2 glasses of champagne. She handed one to Sophie. "That was exceptional, especially for someone who's only been back at the piano for a few months." Sophie sipped the champagne, letting the bubbles dance on her tongue. "It felt good," she admitted. "Better than good. It felt right, as it should," Lisa nodded. "The faculty is impressed. Dr. Nguyen was asking about your background. He's particularly interested in working with you on the Rachmaninoff." Dr. Nguyen was the head of the piano department, a renowned performer whose master classes were legendary for their intensity. The thought that he'd noticed her, that he wanted to work with her, was almost too much to process. "Tomorrow," Sophie said, smiling. "I'll think about all of that tomorrow. Tonight, I just want to enjoy this." As the evening wound down, Sophie found herself standing near one of the lobby windows, looking out at the lights of the city. The past 3 months had been the hardest she'd worked in years, practicing 6 to 8 hours daily while still keeping her weekend shifts at the restaurant. There had been moments of doubt, of frustration, of wondering if she was fooling herself. But tonight had confirmed what she'd begun to suspect. This was where she belonged. Quite a view, isn't it? James had appeared beside her, hands in his pockets. "Beautiful," Sophie agreed. "Thank you for coming tonight. Wouldn't have missed it." He glanced at her. "So the verdict? Was taking this chance worth it?" Sophie thought about the question. The scholarship had changed everything, allowing her to focus on music while still supporting Theo. The medical bills were paid, and her brother was thriving. She was studying with world-class teachers, surrounded by music all day. And most importantly, she'd reconnected with the part of herself she'd buried 5 years ago. "Yes," she said simply. "It was worth it." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city lights. "You know," James said finally, "the Ivory Keys has become quite popular since your video went viral. Robert tells me they're booked solid every weekend." Sophie laughed. "He mentioned that. He's even hired a pianist for Thursday and Sunday nights now. But Friday nights are still special," James continued. "That's when the piano waitress performs," Sophie smiled. It had been Robert's idea, a month after the viral video. Would she consider playing at the restaurant on Friday evenings? Nothing formal, just a short set between her serving duties. The customers loved it, and Sophie had found she enjoyed it too. The more relaxed setting, the appreciative audience, the way regular diners had become friends who requested their favorite pieces. "It's funny," she said. "A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be working as a waitress and a pianist, I would have thought they were crazy. Now it seems like the most natural thing in the world." "Life takes unexpected turns," James agreed. "The trick is recognizing the important moments when they happen. Like a dare from a bored millionaire," Sophie thought. "Like finding the courage to sit down at a piano after 5 years of silence." "Lisa tells me you're composing now," James said. Sophie nodded. It had started as an exercise suggested by one of her professors, a way to understand musical structure better. But soon she'd found herself looking forward to those hours, creating something that was entirely her own. "Just small pieces so far," she said. "But yes, I'm working on a suite inspired by Theo's journey through his illness, finding beauty in difficult moments. I'd like to hear it sometime," James said. Then with a slight smile, "No pressure." "Maybe at the restaurant," Sophie suggested. "Come by on a Friday night. I'll play it for you." "It's a date," James said, then quickly added, "a musical date." "Not a, you know what I mean," Sophie laughed. It was the first time she'd seen the confident businessman flustered. "I know what you mean." As they rejoined the others, Sophie felt a deep sense of contentment. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, juries to pass, techniques to master, competitions to enter. The path of a musician was never easy, but something had shifted permanently that night 3 months ago when James Harrington had pointed at her and said, "I dare you to play." In accepting that dare, Sophie had opened a door she thought was closed forever. She'd stepped through it and found not just music waiting for her, but herself. The self she was always meant to be. The next morning, Sophie woke early despite the late night. Theo was still asleep, sprawled across his bed in teenage abandon. Moving quietly, she made coffee and took it to the small living room of their apartment, where her keyboard stood by the window. It wasn't the grand piano from the recital hall or even the Steinway at the Ivory Keys, but it was hers, and it was enough. Sophie set down her coffee, turned on the keyboard, and began to play. Not Rachmaninoff or Chopin or any of the classical pieces in her repertoire. Something new. Something still forming. Her own composition, notes stringing together like pearls, telling a story only she could tell. Outside, the city was waking up. Inside, in the quiet of the morning, Sophie Chen played on, each note a step further along the path that had once been lost and was now, miraculously, found again.